Hi, my name is Jayreid. I'm a psychotherapist in San Francisco, California, and today I'd like to talk about a belief commonly held by scapegoated children within a narcissistic family, that is, I am defective. Okay, today's belief is pretty simple and succinct in that, as stated, it's just the premise that I am defective. And that is a kind of belief that often gets adopted by the scapegoated child, again, as an adaptive measure to cope with the way they are treated in their narcissistic family. So a narcissistic parent really wants to drill into the scapegoated child's mind that the child is inherently defective. And the reason I believe that the parent seeks to do this is so that the parent does not have to encounter these types of feelings on his or her own. And prior videos have talked about this process that the narcissistic parent will often do in a very pathological way of relocating their own feelings of worthlessness and very much unconsciously and with great certitude finding those feelings or that state of worthlessness in the scapegoated child. And a feature of that is often, in essence, treating the child as though he or she is defective. And what we're talking about today is how the child has to sort of identify with those feelings that are being sort of thrust upon him or her and induced in him or her, and how that belief initially starts off as a way to survive this type of hostile family environment, but later can often, and very much does, impinge on the survivor's quality of their own lives. So again, the parent really needs to bear witness to someone else experiencing these feelings of, say, defectiveness in this case, rather than being the one who's experiencing them. They not only have to bear witness, they also sort of have to feel like, they being the parent needs to feel as though he or she is the one sort of controlling the child's experience of this defectiveness. That's a very important feature of this sort of relocation of the sense of worthlessness or defectiveness into the child. Part of what draws the parent to this way of sort of keeping at bay these awful feelings they're holding is that they get to sort of feel like they're at the throttle or they're pulling the levers as to when they get to sort of bear witness to the child feeling this. And that sort of adds to their sense of feeling buffered or even protected, the parent feeling protected from their own feelings of worthlessness. It also sort of stands to reason why the narcissistic parent can be so domineering, so coercive and controlling to the child, because it's important to feel like they get to control how much, how often the child has to feel this way, whether, defective, worthless, and so on. So, what can it feel like if a child has to adopt this type of belief that, say, I am defective? Well, there's often a deep sense that there's something wrong with him or her. And, there may be very little in the child's life and later, in the adult survivor's life to endorse the sense that there's something wrong with them. They may have a really, strong group of friends. Their teachers may adore them, but the feeling persists that, there is indeed something wrong. And that actually can kind of reify it because, there's that feeling for a child, especially having to make sense of this sort of all on their own, because they, in the type of narcissistic families we're discussing in these videos, the child is in essence friendless in the family. So there's nobody to really serve as an ally to make sense of these feelings that they're being induced to feel that really are not their own and certainly are not reflections of who they actually are. Yet, all that is to say that when they sort of feel this sense of there's something wrong with me and there's nothing on the external, sort of in their external lives to endorse it, it can kind of reaffirm it. Like, well, there must be something even more wrong with me because I feel this way, and yet I can't sort of point to anything in my school life or relationships that would endorse that. And that's not always the case. Sometimes I believe out of compliance with this belief, such problems do arise. But it is sometimes the case. And again, just to, underscore it, typically, and particularly when when a parent is treating a child as though that child is defective, I almost want to say universally true here is that there's a lot right with that child, because it's a child. Like a child is not defective, but the parent is treating the child, or has to treat the child, as though he or she is. And I think what happens is that these very good qualities of the child, in essence the child's own goodness, has to be muted or sort of shoved to the side in order for it to make sense that the parent is treating the child as though the child was so defective. One person, I think, put it very profoundly in a way, where they said, at the time, it would not have made sense for, in this case it was a mother, for my mother's, to be screaming at me if I wasn't as defective as she claimed. And so that, I think, really gets to the nub of why the child, sort of has to adopt these kinds of beliefs to really just find coherence in the abuse they're receiving from a person whom they're dependent on, and really need to sort of see as a viable caretaker. And that caretaker, in this case, is not acting the part whatsoever, yet thereby underscoring why it's so important to adopt and take on all this blame for the child. So the child with this type of belief may find him or herself acting in ways that sort of feel opposite of their natural self. And I think when these kinds of moments occur, they really do signal having or feeling like it's necessary to comply with this type of belief of I am defective. And that experience can very much happen later in life too. After once the child sort of grows to be an adult. And for instance, sometimes I've seen folks who just have a very natural social affability, yet will experience high levels of anxiety in most social interactions, and it's not sort of, I think, standard social anxiety where say there's a deep concern of rejection. It's more that there's sort of this mandate to think that there is a real risk of rejection, and to ignore the information to the contrary. And I think that's different than in sort of standard social anxiety, where it would offer relief if to find information that suggests rejection is not imminent. Whereas when this is the sort of experience that comes from having to comply with a belief such as I am defective, in this kind of a social example, what is dangerous is information to the contrary, information that says one is very well received socially, because that does not comply with the idea that they're defective. So it's just maybe, and it, I think, can be an important way to understand such experiences for the survivor of this type of abuse, who's needed to adopt this type of belief to survive. It's a bit of a sleight of hand in a way that was very adaptive, but can in adult life particularly be kind of confusing at times, and can even kind of confuse the survivor to think, well, maybe I am an anxious person when it comes to social interactions. And it's really, I think, neat and interesting to see that get diffused in the course of recovery, and that what they really get to do is sort of do what and recognize what comes most naturally to them in this case, which is to interact quite well with people and notice the good reception they receive, and know that it's now safe to do both. And that kind of, I think, dovetails into the crux of the process of recovery from this kind of a belief necessary to get through being a scapegoat in a narcissistic family. And that is, it in essence was dangerous for that scapegoated child to think well of him or herself. And what I sort of would describe the general theme of recovering from that is incrementally finding it safer to think otherwise about themselves in the ways that used to keep them safe. So in this case, to gradually think or notice information about themselves that does not comply with the belief and i.e. premise that he or she is defective. And what often happens is that there can be an inherent sense of danger that arises, anxiety, fear, in doing so, because that has not been relationally safe in their past. And that, I think, is where therapy can come in, good relationships can come in, where the person in recovery gets to, in essence, see that the other person's goodwill and the relationship itself is not requiring of the person to think of themselves in a devalued or defective way. Another feature that I think comes along with recovery from this type of trauma and then a belief such as this is kind of goes back to the original dilemma that sort of makes this kind of belief so important to adopt for the scapegoated child, and that is that this kind of child, in essence, has nobody to genuinely attach to. Someone who has benign intentions, recognizes the child for who that child actually is, and is very appreciative, responsive, and caring towards that child. Instead, what the child is offered is this very malignant identity foisted upon that child. And the terms are, so long as you identify with these very malignant feelings and this sort of sense of defectiveness, you can have a shared reality with your family. If you do not identify and sort of claim this role of scapegoat we insist on putting you in essence have nobody. And having nobody brings about what is termed dysphoria. Dysphoria is defined as a profound state of unease or dissatisfaction. It's the opposite of euphoria. And I think that umbrella term sort of captures all of the sort of suffering and on an emotional level that is used as leverage to coerce the child to comply with this kind of a belief and treatment in the family that forces them to conclude that the child themselves is defective. Is that dysphoric reaction that will occur if they don't sort of feel like they're sharing a reality with the family. And I think that what happens often for the scapegoated child is that being the way they naturally are and genuinely are is associated with that state and feeling of dysphoria. And it can come in the form of despair, profound anger, panic, fear. There's a guy named James Masterson who's termed it the abandonment depression, and it sort of is marked by those sort of states. And I think that's a very good way to represent this dysphoria that the child faces if he doesn't comply with the scapegoated role. And sometimes in the process of recovery, it can be useful to identify such feelings when they come up so that they can be understood, in a new relationship that is good to that person, so that the association between the person's sort of genuine actual self and the dysphoria that really was fused often in the narcissistic family and growing up gets to be over time decoupled, so that the survivor gets to sort of welcome back in his or her sort of real self, their genuine sort of desires, ambitions, and that dysphoria that used to accompany it gets to be understood, felt as needed, but doesn't become a deterrent for the survivor from sort of letting themselves live sort of from their genuine selves. The language as to what is a genuine self versus what is not, it can get clumsy, and I don't mean to imply that there's like a false self that is inauthentic and sort of a real self that is authentic. The truth is that, whether it's the person complying with the scapegoated role or feeling the dysphoria that would come with not complying, particularly in childhood, those are all parts of one's, let's call it, real self, but they are sort of needing to get sort of split apart to kind of meet the different demands. Thanks for watching today, and thank you again for everyone's continued engagement with the videos and the channel. I very much appreciate the comments, and can't respond just due to limitations on time, but I think that the community being built in response to each other's comments is shown to be quite supportive, and just it looks like a valuable project that's sort of coming together. Well, thanks for watching this week. Take good care, and I look forward to posting next week's video. The videos are always posted Sundays at 9 a.m. Pacific Standard Time.